Imagine you are a British tourist in Dubai.
Okay.
You're standing in your luxury hotel room, looking out these massive floor-to-ceiling windows at just the absolute pinnacle of curated modern wealth.
Right. All the glass and steel.
Exactly. But instead of that endless pristine horizon, you see this thick black plume of smoke just rising straight up from the central business district. A drone strike just hit.
Which is just a totally visceral, shocking thing to see.
Oh, completely. It's terrifying. So you do what, anyone in the 21st century does, right? You pull out your phone, you film the smoke, and you post it online.
Naturally.
But then within hours, you are arrested under their strict cybercrime laws.
Wow.
Yeah. The state literally treats your Instagram post as a greater threat to its security than the actual explosion you just filmed.
That really paints a picture.
It does. And welcome to the deep dive, where the firewalls between curated realities, global economics, and actual geopolitical warfare have just completely collapsed.
It really is an unprecedented convergence we're living through right now. I mean, we are looking at a highly reactive system where a single military action doesn't just, stay on a battlefield.
Right.
It immediately rewrites global supply chains. It manipulates local politics half a world away. And it really shatters domestic social cohesion.
Exactly. And to understand this absolute multi-car pileup of geopolitics and everyday economics, the material we're unpacking today comes from a recent broadcast of Novara Media's show, Novara Live.
Right. A very detailed broadcast.
Super detailed. And the mission for our deep dive today is to take the very specific arguments and facts presented in that broadcast and use them to really map out how a massive escalating shock in the Middle East is sending these violent ripples through the whole global economy.
Yeah, the domino effect.
Exactly. And from there, we're going to look at the other major shockwave to dissect, which is how emerging technologies, specifically artificial intelligence, are being weaponized.
Right, weaponized by executives to restructure the white-collar workforce.
Yes, and also weaponized by political operatives in local grassroots elections. It is a massive amount of ground to cover today, and the Novara panel pulls absolutely no punches.
No, they don't. Which actually brings us to an incredibly important point we really need to establish right at the top here.
Yeah, please do.
Before we get into the weeds of this broadcast, I just need to deliver a clear disclaimer to you, the listener.
Very important.
Because the source material we are examining today contains highly charged, explicit political viewpoints. I mean, it repeatedly describes the current military actions in the Middle East as, quote, illegal wars.
Rope.
It heavily criticizes capitalism and specific corporate leaders, and it actively attacks prominent figures on both the political right and the left. So we must explicitly state our boundaries here. We are not taking sides.
Not at all.
Our goal today is strictly to map out the arguments, the facts, and the perspectives presented in this specific source material so that you can understand the conversation happening in this space without us endorsing any of the political framing. We're just here to be your guides through the text, not your political pundits.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the broadcast starts by dropping us right into the middle of the rhetoric surrounding the massive military escalation involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran.
Yeah, they jump right in.
And the contrast they paint between the political narrative coming out of Washington and the visual reality emerging on the ground is just incredibly jarring.
It's night and day.
It really is. They zero in on a press conference given by the U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth. And the framing he uses isn't just, confident. It's exceptionally bombastic.
Oh, absolutely.
He claims that over 15,000 enemy targets have been struck by U.S. and Israeli forces. He boasts that they are hitting well over 1,000 targets a day.
Right, and he doesn't stop at just the tactical numbers either. What the Novara crew highlighted is how heavily Hegseth leans into this deep psychological profiling.
Yeah, the character assassination.
Exactly. I mean, in the transcript of his press conference, he describes the Iranian leadership as desperate, hiding, and cowering.
He actually goes so far as to compare them to rats going underground, right?
He does. He specifically targets the new supreme leader, claiming he's wounded, likely disfigured, and hiding in the shadows because he lacks the technological or physical capability to even broadcast a voice or video message.
So he's relying entirely on a written statement, according to Hegseth.
Right. Hegseth's narrative is that the leader is on the run, terrified, and totally stripped of legitimacy. And then, to throw more rhetorical fuel on the fire, the broadcast notes that Donald Trump publicly referred to the Iranians as deranged scumbags.
Just really intense language. They're painting this picture of total, overwhelming, clean dominance where the enemy is utterly broken and hiding in the dirt.
Right. That's the official story.
But then the broadcast immediately pivots to show the contrasting reality that they are observing. And this was fascinating. They reference videos posted by Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araqi.
Yeah, the contrast here is wild.
It's crazy. And to be clear, these aren't like grainy videos shot in some undisclosed bunker. This is high-definition footage of him and the Iranian president, Masoud Pezeshkian, out in the open streets of Tehran.
In broad daylight.
In broad daylight.
Right.
During the Al-Quds Day or Jerusalem Day holiday, the panel explicitly points out that Pezeshkian is riding on the back of a motorcycle.
Just waving at the crowds.
Waving at massive crowds of people, all while smoke from nearby missile strikes is visibly rising in the background.
Yeah.
It is a direct, deliberate, visual counter-narrative to Hegseth's claim that the leadership is cowering underground.
It's a textbook example of narrative warfare happening in real time, played out entirely across social media feeds. But, the analysis provided doesn't just contrast the official rhetoric with social media videos from Iranian officials. They also dig into the very real, very grim human cost on the U.S. military side.
Which severely complicates that Washington narrative of a, clean one-sided victory.
Exactly. They detail the crash of a U.S. KC-135 refueling plane in western Iraq, which tragically killed 4 service members.
And even the facts of that specific crash are fiercely contested in the material, right?
Yeah, highly contested.
U.S. Central Command put out a very sanitized statement saying the plane went down over friendly airspace during an operation they named Epic Fury. And they explicitly stated it was not due to hostile fire.
But the Novara hosts point out that the specific region of western Iraq where it crashed is heavily populated by pro-Iranian militias.
Right.
And Iranian state TV immediately claimed an allied group shot the plane down with a surface-to-air missile.
Wow.
And then the broadcast tallies the broader toll. They note 13 U.S. service people have died in just the 2 weeks since the attacks began.
Which they point out is almost 1 a day.
Right. And over 170 U.S. military personnel have been injured, with reports specifically citing things like traumatic brain injuries and amputations.
God, it's just awful. Hearing all this, it makes me think of an analogy. Hegseth's press conference feels a bit like, and the Novara panel actually uses this exact phrase, the everyone is 12 theory.
Oh, yeah, the schoolyard bully concept.
Exactly. It's this idea that global superpowers, these vast entities with the literal capacity to destroy the planet, are making life-or-death decisions with the rhetorical maturity of schoolyard bullies making taunts.
Right.
It's all name-calling. They're rats. They're scumbags. We're winning. But the broadcast claims that public polling in both the U.S. and the U.K. shows majority opposition to this war.
Yes, that's a key point they make.
So my question to you is, if the public is largely against this, why is the political rhetoric from leadership so exceptionally bombastic and almost cartoonishly aggressive?
What's fascinating here is the inverse relationship between weak public support and hyper-aggressive official rhetoric.
Inverse relationship. Okay.
Yeah. When a government enters a conflict that lacks a clear popular mandate, which this broadcast strongly insists is the case right now, the state has to engage in a very specific psychological operation that political scientists call manufacturing consent.
Manufacturing consent. So they have to force the public to agree.
Basically, the volume of the political rhetoric has to be turned up to 11 to drown out the domestic dissonance. I mean, if your internal polling is bad, you simply cannot rely on quiet, measured statesmanship.
Right. You can't be subtle.
You have to project absolute, unquestionable dominance. You have to make the victory seem so inevitable and the enemy so pathetic that the public feels almost foolish for opposing it.
Because if you admit for even a second that it's a complicated, messy slog where service members are suffering traumatic brain injuries for unclear objectives, you instantly lose whatever fragile public support you have left.
Precisely. You completely lose the narrative. And the Novara panel highlights a very telling moment in Hegseth's press conference that illustrates the mechanics of this perfectly.
Oh, the part with the media.
Yes. Hegseth actually lashes out at the reporters in the room. He complains specifically about the lower thirds, the scrolling text banners at the bottom of the TV news screens.
Right, the ticker.
Right. He says the media is running headlines like Middle East war intensifies, and he essentially demands what he calls a patriotic press.
A patriotic press.
He literally tells the press what the banner should read. He says it should say, Iran shrinking, or Iran increasingly desperate.
That is wild.
He wants the media to act not as an objective observer, but as a direct extension of the state's public relations arm.
It is actively attempting to force the media to be cheerleaders. And the broadcast is deeply critical of this, noting that a government official dictating headlines for a patriotic press is incredibly dangerous to the concept of a free press.
Absolutely.
But as we know, wars rarely stay neatly within the borders of the countries named in the official declarations.
No, they always spill over.
Yeah. The rhetoric might try to contain the narrative to a simple us versus them, but the physical violence refuses to be contained. Which brings us to the regional and global spillover of this conflict.
Yes, so the broadcast moves outward from that direct U.S., Israel, Iran dynamic to map out how the kinetic energy of this conflict is fracturing the wider region.
Right.
They detail a major intensification of fighting in Iraq. Bases in Iraqi Kurdistan and Baghdad were hit by drone attacks. A French Kurdish base caught fire.
And a French soldier was killed.
Yes, a French soldier was killed and 6 others were injured. So this isn't just a localized skirmish. NATO allied forces are actively taking casualties.
And then there's the detail about the UAE that we touched on at the very beginning.
Right.
The detail that absolutely stopped me in my tracks.
The Dubai drone strike.
Yeah, they mentioned smoke rising from the central business district in Dubai. But footage of this is incredibly rare. And why? Because the government is aggressively clamping down on anyone posting videos of the attacks to social media.
Right, the cybercrime laws.
They mention a 60-year-old British tourist who is among 20 people charged under the country's cybercrime laws simply for sharing a video of the strikes. Let's just pause and really unpack the mechanics of that. Why does a state arrest a tourist for pointing a phone at the sky?
Well, you have to look at the macroeconomic model of the United Arab Emirates. It is an economy built entirely on the perception of total, unwavering stability.
Perception being the key word.
Exactly. It's a haven for international capital, it's a playground for global influencers, and a massive hub for luxury real estate. The primary commodity they are selling isn't just oil, it's the illusion of an untouched, futuristic oasis.
Right, because a highly curated global city.
Yes. And a video of a drone strike piercing that skyline instantly shatters that illusion.
Oof, it's gone.
If investors believe Dubai is vulnerable to regional warfare, capital flight happens literally overnight. So from the perspective of the state, the tourist sharing the video is actively sabotaging the national economy. The state treats the broadcasting of the reality as a greater crime than the reality itself. They use these cybercrime laws as a shield to protect their economic vulnerabilities from the geopolitical fallout.
That is just wild. And the spillover continues to Lebanon, too.
It does.
The broadcast states that Israel has struck Lebanon over 1,100 times recently, killing over 770 people. And these strikes are expanding geographically.
Right. They aren't just contained to the southern suburbs of Beirut anymore.
No, they're hitting northern suburbs right near the Lebanese government's official headquarters. The geography of the violence is spreading rapidly, destabilizing entire national governments.
And tragically, the geography of the violence isn't just limited to the Middle East either.
No, it made it all the way to the U.S.
Right. The panel traces the spillover directly to domestic U.S. soil. They detail a horrific incident in West Bloomfield, Michigan.
This was so tough to read.
It really was. An armed 41-year-old man, a Lebanese-born U.S. citizen named Ian Gazelle, drove a vehicle into a large Reform synagogue complex. He was shot dead by security before he could harm any of the staff or the 140 children inside the building's early childhood center.
Thank God those children were safe.
Yeah.
But the Navarra hosts point out the specific motive here, which inextricably links this local tragedy in Michigan to the global conflict.
Yes.
Ghazal had recently posted photos of his niece and nephew, Fatima and Ali. Those 2 young children, along with Ghazal's 2 brothers, were killed in an Israeli strike in Lebanon just the week prior.
It's just a devastating chain of events.
It is staggering when you look at it laid out like this, from decisions made in war rooms in Washington and Tehran, to drones hitting bases in Kurdistan, to cybercrime arrests of tourists in Dubai, to a grieving, broken man attacking a synagogue in Michigan.
It's all connected.
Right. The Navarra broadcast frames all of this through the lens of Western imperialism and what they call a Greater Israel Project. But I have to push back here and ask you, looking at this terrifying domino effect, how much of this is deliberate, calculated geopolitical strategy, and how much is just chaotic, uncontrollable chain reactions?
I mean, that is the critical question of modern warfare. The argument presented by the Navarra panel, and remember, we are strictly analyzing their specific viewpoint here, is that this is fundamentally a geopolitical conflict driven by long-term strategies for power and imperialism.
Right, not just random chaos.
Right. They argue that figures like Benjamin Netanyahu have spent decades deliberately framing Iran as the ultimate existential danger to justify a wider, expansive military footprint.
Okay.
However, the mechanisms of the spillover, like a grieving relative in Michigan snapping and committing an act of terror, represent the chaotic, uncontrollable externalities of that grand strategy.
You can plan the strike, but not the reaction.
Exactly. You can plan the missile strike, but you cannot plan the psychological break of the victim's uncle living in the American Midwest.
The butterfly effect, but with heavy munitions. You flap a wing in Beirut, and a tragedy almost occurs in West Bloomfield.
That's a very dark, but very accurate way to put it. And the experts on the panel make a very deliberate, crucial point here to warn against the danger of collective blame.
Yes, this is a huge point in the broadcast.
The broadcast explicitly condemns the ideology that looks at a complex geopolitical conflict and blames ordinary people for the actions of a state apparatus.
Right.
They point out the sheer injustice and anti-Semitism of blaming ordinary Jewish people in a Michigan synagogue for the military actions of the Israeli government, just as they vehemently condemn Trump and Hegseth for rhetorically dehumanizing ordinary Iranians when discussing the Iranian regime.
It's a really important distinction.
It is. They argue that framing this as a religious proxy war, Christians versus Muslims or Jews versus Muslims, is a deliberate narrative tactic used by politicians.
To kind of obscure the real motives.
Exactly. It is designed to obscure the fact that this is truly, at its core, a material war over power, land, and resources.
Which is the perfect pivot. Because if we connect this to the bigger picture, you simply cannot talk about a geopolitical war over material resources in the Middle East without talking about the most critical resource of all. Right. Conflicts are fought with weapons and rhetoric, but they're paid for with energy. This brings us to the massive economic shockwave currently crashing into the global oil markets.
Yes. Here is where the foreign policy decisions instantly become domestic economic crises. The broadcast notes that Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, is effectively blockading the Strait of Hormuz.
Okay, for those who aren't shipping nerds, let's explain the geography of that really quickly. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the open ocean.
It's a tiny bottleneck.
Exactly. It is arguably the most important shipping choke point on the entire planet. Roughly a fifth of the world's total oil consumption passes through that single narrow channel.
Wow.
And Iran has vowed not to let a single liter of oil through, explicitly targeting any U.S. or Israeli-aligned ships.
The disruption is monumental. I mean, the International Energy Agency claimed this resulting price spike completely dwarfed the previous energy crisis triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Really? Dwarfed it?
Yes. The broadcast states that oil prices hit almost $120 a barrel. And to put the severity of that in perspective, they note that the average price heading into 2025 was around $69 a barrel.
Oh my God.
So that is a near 50% increase essentially overnight.
So what does this actually mean for the everyday economy? Think of the global oil market not just as a commodity, but as the human circulatory system in a state of shock.
Okay, I like that analogy.
You put a tourniquet on a major artery, like blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and the blood pressure doesn't just disappear, right? It aggressively spikes everywhere else in the body to compensate.
Right, the pressure has to go somewhere.
It spikes in the cost of a winter utility bill for a pensioner in the UK.
Wow.
It spikes at the gas pump for a commuter in Ohio. And suddenly, to keep the entire system from going into cardiac arrest, governments have to start desperately searching for other ways to relieve the pressure.
Yeah.
Which leads to what the broadcast frames as the most staggering geopolitical irony of this entire situation.
Oh, the Russian oil waiver.
Exactly. The broadcast details how U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent issued a 30-day sanctions waiver on Russian oil.
It's just incredible.
Think about the hypocrisy there.
Yeah.
The U.S. and its allies had spent years building a complex web of sanctions against Russian energy to financially punish Vladimir Putin for the invasion of Ukraine.
Right.
But because the U.S. administration is absolutely terrified of the domestic economic blowback of the Iran conflict, specifically how $120 oil will look to voters right before the November midterms, they effectively give Russia a temporary pass to pump their oil back into the market to try and stabilize global prices.
And the economic mechanics, the broadcast details regarding this waiver are just fascinating to unpack.
Yeah, explain the crude oil stuff, because that was interesting.
Right. You have to understand the difference between the types of crude oil. Generally, the global standard is Brent crude. It's light, it's sweet, it's easy to refine.
It's the good stuff.
Exactly. Russian oil, on the other hand, is typically Urals crude, which is heavier and much harder to refine. Because of the sanctions and its lower quality, Russian Urals crude normally trades at a significant discount compared to Brent crude. There is a noticeable price gap.
Makes sense.
But because of the crisis in the Middle East, the Novara panel points out that this traditional price gap completely vanished.
Because desperation overrides quality. I mean, when a fifth of the world's oil is trapped behind the Strait of Hormuz, nobody cares if the oil is heavy or light. They just need the energy.
Exactly. Russian oil, which is exported from ports entirely unaffected by the Strait of Hormuz blockade, suddenly became the most in-demand commodity on Earth.
Wow.
The broadcast notes that Russian oil revenues shot up 17% in just a couple of weeks.
Unbelievable.
And here is the kicker. Because the Russian state owns a massive direct stake in its domestic oil industry, those bumper revenues aren't just going to private shareholders.
Where do they go?
They go straight into the national treasury, directly funding their ongoing war effort in Ukraine.
It is genuinely mind-bending when you map out the causality. So the U.S. and Israel attack Iranian targets, which prompts Iran to blockade the Strait of Hormuz, which creates a massive supply shock that spikes the price of oil to $120 a barrel, which panics U.S. politicians facing midterms, which forces the U.S. to lift sanctions on Russian energy, which creates a windfall profit that directly funds the Russian war machine in Ukraine.
It is a perfect, tragic circle of geopolitical consequence.
It really is. But the broadcast doesn't just lay out this problem. They use this specific crisis to heavily critique the competing macroeconomic models of how different Western nations handle their energy security.
They do. They hold up the French and Norwegian models as empirical successes and heavily criticize the structural models of the UK and the US.
Right. Let's talk about France first.
So according to the data discussed, during the previous major oil shock in 2022, France managed to cap their citizens' utility bill rises at a mere 4%.
4%. Well, people in other countries were seeing their bills double or triple. How did France mathematically achieve that?
Through a combination of infrastructure and state control. First, France has a largely decarbonized grid, heavily reliant on domestic nuclear power.
So they are less susceptible to the whims of global fossil fuel markets.
Exactly. And second, and more importantly for this critique, the French state fully nationalized the massive energy company EDF.
Oh, okay.
Because the company was state-owned, the government could make the political decision to have the company absorb the financial shock of the energy crisis rather than passing those exorbitant costs directly down to the consumers.
That makes total sense. And then there's Norway, which the panel also praises. Norway has a massive amount of fossil fuels, but they maintain a majority state ownership stake in their oil industry.
Right.
Instead of using those revenues to fund immediate military conflicts or enrich private executives, Norway invested the profits into a massive sovereign wealth fund.
Yeah.
And they're now using that enormous pool of state capital to finance heavy, aggressive investments into green energy infrastructure.
Yeah, they planned ahead. In stark contrast to those state-led models, the broadcast heavily criticizes the UK.
Oh yeah, they really went after the UK.
They point out that the UK is deeply reliant on imported gas for heating and electricity. Furthermore, they trace the vulnerability back to the privatization of the North Sea oil reserves under Margaret Thatcher's government in the 1980s.
Right.
And they point out an incredible, almost painful irony here. Because the British oil fields are privatized and globally traded, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund actually owns stakes in them.
Wait, really?
Yes. So Norway makes money off British oil while British citizens struggle to pay their own heating bills.
That is a brutal economic reality check. And they don't spare the U.S. model either. They specifically attack the Trump administration's drill baby drill philosophy.
Right.
The panel argues that simply extracting more domestic fossil fuels doesn't create true energy independence, because oil is a globally priced commodity. If a war breaks out in the Middle East, the price of oil produced in Texas still goes up, and the American consumer still pays the price.
Exactly. The market is completely interconnected.
But let me push back on the Novara panel's framing here. They strongly advocate for a purely green energy transition, mixed with aggressive state nationalization, as the only path to achieve true economic sovereignty.
Yes, that's their core argument.
They argue renewables are inherently sovereign. You can't embargo the wind or blockade the sun. But doesn't the immediate panicked reaction of the U.S. and U.K. governments to this Hormuz crisis prove that regardless of long-term green utopian goals, in the short term, fossil fuels absolutely still dictate global security, geopolitical leverage, and political survival?
That is the crux of the debate, and honestly, it is a very fair pushback. The panel acknowledges that fossil fuels dictate the current reality, which is why they introduced the concept of warflation.
Warflation, that's a new term for me.
Yeah, they attribute it to the economic commentator Grace Blakely. Warflation is the direct, measurable inflation of the cost of living caused by military conflict disrupting scarce global resources.
Makes sense.
But the argument made in the broadcast is that this reliance is a manufactured trap. They argue we are choosing to remain vulnerable to warflation.
By choosing to stick with oil.
Right. To illustrate this, they point out the deep political hypocrisy of right-wing parties, specifically citing the Reform Party in the UK.
Oh, this part was fascinating.
The panel claims that these political factions are often the loudest, most aggressive cheerleaders for kinetic military action in the Middle East. But when that exact military action inevitably blocks shipping lanes and spikes the cost of fuel, those same politicians immediately pivot their messaging.
Right, they don't blame the war.
Exactly. They complain loudly about the high prices at the pump, but instead of blaming the military intervention they just supported, they blame green energy policies, environmental regulations, and net zero targets for making energy too expensive.
Unbelievable.
The broadcast argues this is a deliberate, cynical misdirection designed to protect the petrochemical companies, who are simultaneously pulling in massive, record-breaking bumper profits during the crisis.
It is a fascinating look at how the hoarding and weaponization of physical resources governs our physical realities.
It really is.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because we hit a massive transition here. While the blue-collar physical world is being squeezed by the price of oil and the blockades of shipping lanes, the white-collar digital world is facing a completely different, entirely manufactured shockwave.
Right, the AI shockwave.
Exactly. And the common thread connecting them is the oligarchic control of resources. In the Middle East, the resource is physical energy. In the digital world, the resource is human productivity. And the weapon being used to hoard that productivity is artificial intelligence.
Yes, so the broadcast pivots from the geopolitics of oil to the socioeconomics of AI. And they focus heavily on a recent, highly controversial interview given by Alex Karp, the CEO of the U.S. software and data integration giant Palantir.
Palantir.
The host of the Navarra show pulls absolutely no punches, immediately framing Karp as an evangelist for the technist politics of the AI oligarchy.
And Karp's prediction in this interview is honestly staggering to listen to. He doesn't sugarcoat it at all. He openly states that AI is going to massively disrupt the economic and therefore the political power of a very specific demographic.
Yeah, he was very specific.
He says that technology will displace highly educated, often female voters who vote mostly Democrat, who currently work in the white-collar service sector.
All right.
And Karp claims that this disruption will effectively shift economic leverage and cultural power toward vocationally trained, working-class, often male voters who work in physical trades that AI cannot currently replicate.
And he frames this not as a tragedy, but as an inevitable, almost necessary disruption to the very fabric of modern society.
You practically sounded excited about it.
He really did. He goes on to warn that the political class must figure out how to explain to these displaced educated workers why they are suddenly going to have, and this is a direct quote from Karp, less good and less interesting jobs.
Let's just sit with the audacity of that statement for a second. It is like a corporate game of musical chairs. But in this specific game, the executives at the top are suddenly pulling away half the chairs from the floor.
Right.
And instead of apologizing or using their massive resources to build more chairs, they are looking at the remaining players, the white-collar office workers, and the blue-collar tradespeople, and actively encouraging them to fight each other for the right to sit on the floor while the executives take the chairs home.
That's a great analogy. And the Navarra panel's critique of Karp's worldview is severe. I mean, they don't just disagree with his politics, they completely deconstruct his fundamental economic premise.
Yeah, they tore it apart.
They describe his analysis of class and the economy as entirely vibes-based, rather than rooted in actual material reality or structural economic relationship.
Vibes-based. Right, because Karp is associating class purely with cultural signifiers. Who votes Democrat, who goes to university, who drinks lattes in an office, versus who wears a hard hat and works with their hands. He's treating the economy like a culture war algorithm.
Exactly. And the broadcast points out a glaring fundamental flaw in his economic logic regarding the labor market.
Let's hear.
Let's break down the mechanics of his prediction. Karp suggests that displacing white-collar workers with AI will somehow automatically empower blue-collar tradesmen.
Okay.
But the Navarra hosts argue that if you suddenly have a massive glut of unemployed, highly educated white-collar workers who are forced to seek work in the manual trades or gig economy because AI took their administrative or creative jobs, you are simply creating a massive labor surplus in the blue-collar sector.
And basic supply and demand dictates that a labor surplus is terrible for the worker.
Yeah.
I mean, if there are suddenly 10 people applying to be an apprentice plumber or an electrician where there used to be 2, the employer has all the leverage.
Exactly.
That surplus will drive down the wages, benefits, and economic leverage of those blue-collar workers, not increase them.
Precisely. The panel also points out that Karp's nostalgic idea of a booming mid-century manufacturing sector returning to save the working class is a complete myth.
A total myth.
They note that manufacturing jobs are currently at record lows as a percentage of the U.S. job market. And that isn't because people forgot how to build things. It is largely due to previous waves of factory automation and industrial offshoring.
Yeah.
The idea that displaced office workers will just go work in a factory ignores the reality that the factories are already automated.
But let me play devil's advocate here, because we have to look at this from all sides. Is Karp entirely wrong about the nature of the technological shift we are seeing?
Go on.
If an AI can write flawless Python code, draft a complex legal brief in seconds, and analyze thousands of pages of medical data, but it absolutely cannot fix a broken pipe, wire a house, or pour concrete, isn't a shift in economic leverage toward physical vocational trades somewhat mathematically inevitable? The trades have a physical moat that the knowledge workers simply do not have anymore.
It's a fair point, and the trades undoubtedly have a physical moat for now. But the panel argues that Karp's framing of this shift is a deliberate divide-and-rule tactic.
Divide and rule, okay.
The Novara hosts argue that by framing this as a culture war between the educated female Democrat and the working-class male, Karp is deliberately pitting workers against each other.
Classic misdirection.
Right. They argue the goal is to redirect the public's anxiety and anger laterally at each other rather than vertically, at the oligarchs who actually own the AI servers and are hoarding the massive, unprecedented productivity gains generated by the technology.
So they want us fighting over crumbs while they eat the whole cake.
Exactly. And to explain how we arrived at this cynical moment, the panel traces a fascinating evolution of macroeconomic history.
Let's go through that.
They start by talking about Fordism, referencing the era of Henry Ford in the early to mid-20th century. The core tenet of Fordism was that industrial capitalists understood they had to pay their workers a high enough wage to actually afford to buy the cars they were building on the assembly line.
So there's a basic, understood social contract that consumption required a paid workforce.
Yes. Then they moved to the neoliberal era of the late 20th century.
Characterized by privatization, deregulation, all that.
Right, and a hyper-focus on quick shareholder profits, often at the direct expense of worker wages and consumer purchasing power. The social contract began to fray.
It started unraveling.
And finally, they argue we have entered a new, deeply cynical phase of capitalism, a phase where elite CEOs like Karp openly, publicly admit they're making people's jobs worse.
They're just saying the quiet part out loud now.
They are. The broadcast references another unnamed tech CEO who recently said, "We need to have pain in the economy to reset worker expectations."
The mask is entirely off.
It is. They are no longer even pretending to sell the old utopian myth of the 1950s. You know, the promise that automation would create a leisure society where robots do the work and humans enjoy a 3-day work week.
Yeah, we aren't getting the Jetsons' future.
No. Instead, they are bluntly admitting the jobs will be worse, the pay will be less, and they expect society to just accept it as the natural order of technological progress.
So what is the Novara panel's proposed solution to this impending dystopian AI future? Because they aren't just complaining. They have a specific ideological stance.
They are very clear and unapologetic about their ideological stance here. They quote Geoffrey Hinton, often called the godfather of AI, from a recent Channel 4 news interview.
Oh, Hinton. Yeah, what did he say?
Hinton stated that there is only one structural solution to prevent the wealth generated by AI from funneling entirely to the top 1%. socialism.
Straight up socialist.
Yes. The broadcast argues forcefully for the collective democratic ownership of AI technology and its underlying infrastructure, so that the immense productivity gains benefit society as a whole.
Like funding universal basic income or better public services.
Exactly, rather than just padding the stock portfolios of a few tech executives in Silicon Valley.
It's a massive, fundamental debate about the future of human labor. But while CEOs like Karp are talking about AI coming for people's jobs and their economic power, the broadcast ends by showing how AI is actively, right now, coming for people's votes.
Yes, the final segment of the Novara broadcast dives into an incredibly disturbing investigation they conducted alongside the Bureau of Investigative Journalism.
This part was terrifying.
It centers on a digital phenomenon they call AI slop, specifically focusing on an AI-generated right-wing rapper named Danny Bones.
Danny Bones. This entire story is wild. They describe this character as an AI-generated skinhead, usually draped in the Union Jack or St. George's flag, and sometimes even visually cosplaying as a mass deportation officer.
Yeah, the imagery is very aggressive.
He is the creation of a digital group called the Node Project. And the music he makes, specifically a viral track called This Is England, is a synthesized, algorithmic amalgamation of white nationalist tropes and deep-seated political grievances.
Very targeted lyrics.
The lyrics complain bitterly about open borders,
Mhm.
a perceived lack of free speech, rising street crime, and crumbling public services.
But we need to be clear, this isn't just an edgy art project sitting in the dark, ignored corners of the internet.
No, it was weaponized.
The broadcast details how the Danny Bones character was specifically deployed as a targeted political weapon during a recent local election in the UK, the Gorton and Denton by-election.
Wow.
The AI rapper was used to directly unhack the Green Party candidate, Hannah Spencer, using explicitly Islamophobic rhetoric. The track complained about seeing Bengali, Palestinian, and Pakistani flags flying in the community and claimed that the left are getting used by immigrants.
It is entirely synthetic outrage deployed for real-world political gain. And the ties to formal political power structures get even darker, don't they?
They do. The broadcast notes that the Node Project, the creators of this Danny Bones character, also produced a CGI history video for Advance UK, which the Novara panel describes as a far-right political party actively backed by tech billionaire Elon Musk.
Insane. When the Bureau of Investigative Journalism confronted the Node Project about this, their defense was essentially that they are just a small group of independent creatives.
Just artists, they claimed.
Right. They claimed the Advance UK video was just a freelance commercial commission. And they outright denied that the Danny Bones character or its lyrical content was Islamophobic, framing it merely as provocative art.
Yes.
But this is exactly what I want to ask you about, because this gets to the heart of the tech regulation debate. The creators are claiming this is just freelance art, utilizing a new synthesizer tool. But where exactly is the line between artistic expression, using a new digital medium, and deploying automated algorithmic political warfare?
This raises an important question, particularly regarding the response of our regulatory institutions, which seem completely unequipped to handle this.
Oh, completely.
The broadcast points out that the UK Electoral Commission's response to this specific investigation was incredibly weak. They essentially just issued a statement encouraging people to think critically about what they're seeing.
Think critically. I mean, when you are up against a machine capable of generating 1,000 targeted, hyper-realistic propaganda songs an hour, telling the public to think critically is like bringing an umbrella to a Category 5 hurricane. It is an absolute abdication of regulatory responsibility.
Exactly. And the Novara reporter makes a crucial point about the psychological mechanism of this AI slop. You asked where the line is between art and warfare.
Right.
The line blurs because of how human psychology interacts with the platform algorithms. The reporter admits something very telling. Even though the music is objectively terrible, formulaic, and clearly artificial upon close inspection, it is incredibly catchy.
That's the scariest part.
The visuals are hyper-real. The broadcast warns that it almost doesn't matter if people know it's AI.
Because the AI doesn't care about truth. It only cares about engagement.
Right. The AI models used to generate this music programs like Suno or Udio are trained on vast data sets of human emotion and musical theory to perfectly hit the frequency of genuine human grievance.
So it knows exactly which buttons to push.
Yes. It taps into very real, very legitimate anger about the rising cost of living and crumbling municipal services, and then cynically synthesizes that valid anger with extreme nationalist, xenophobic rhetoric.
And the distribution platforms are completely struggling to keep up with the ethics of this. The broadcast notes that TikTok eventually removed the Danny Bones content after it was flagged.
Which is something, at least.
YouTube took a middle ground approach and added a label saying the content was AI generated. But Spotify. This is the craziest part.
Yeah, this is baffling.
Spotify reviewed the Danny Bones track using actual human moderators and determined it didn't break their hate speech rules, so it stayed up on the platform. How does a human moderator look at an AI skinhead rapping about Pakistani flags ruining England and say, yeah, this is fine?
Because the platforms are caught in a massive structural contradiction between their stated moderation ethics and their financial incentives.
Explain that.
Well, you have to look at how Spotify's algorithmic engagement metrics work. The platform prioritizes completion rate and replayability. As the broadcast points out, the algorithm naturally rewards content that stirs things up.
Anger sells.
Anger absolutely sells. Divisive, angry rhetoric drives high emotional engagement, which keeps users on the app longer, which drives ad revenue and subscription retention.
Right.
So you have a perfect toxic marriage of slop politics and slop AI distributed by tech platforms that financially benefit from the very societal division the AI is generating. The human moderators are operating within a corporate structure that fundamentally wants the slop to stay online because the slop makes money.
Wow. We have covered an immense, heavy amount of ground today.
We really have.
And when you pull back and look at all these puzzle pieces together, from the kinetic explosions of missiles in the Middle East and the economic shockwaves of a $120 barrel of oil, to the quiet digital shockwaves of Palantir's AI coming for white-collar jobs and synthetic right-wing rappers manipulating local by-elections, you realize we are living through a massive, simultaneous restructuring of global power.
It's all happening at once.
The physical resources and the digital resources are being hoarded and weaponized at the exact same time.
It can feel entirely overwhelming to look at the board right now, but, the goal of deep dives like this is to show you the wiring beneath the floorboards.
Exactly.
Whether it is Pete Hegseth trying to dictate TV headlines to manufacture domestic consent for a foreign war, or tech CEOs using vibes-based cultural analysis to divide the working class, or an AI algorithm generating a skinhead rapper to influence a local election, these are all constructed narratives.
They aren't accidents.
No, they are mechanisms. Understanding the actual mechanics of how these narratives are built and why they are deployed gives you the power to see through the noise.
Yeah.
You aren't just a passive consumer of this chaos. You can be a critical, informed observer of it.
Knowledge is the best armor. It allows you to step out of the chaotic machinery. But I won't leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day.
Okay.
We talk about how Danny Bones, the AI rapper, was designed to tap into real political anger and amplify it for clicks and votes.
Right.
If AI can now perfectly simulate grassroots political rage and social media algorithms naturally reward that synthetic outrage with maximum financial and cultural visibility, what happens to genuine democracy when our real human politicians start changing their actual policies to appease a synthetic, algorithmically generated anger?
A truly chilling question to consider.
Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.